Hello there and welcome to The Sleepy Astronaut, where the ancient whispers of stone and starlight guide us through the gentle currents of sleep. Tonight's celestial journey takes us into one of the most extraordinary convergences in human history, where ancient prophecies carved in stone seem to have anticipated the arrival of a visitor from beyond our solar system. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. And as we drift through this cosmic tale, perhaps you'll find yourself wondering if our ancestors knew something we're only beginning to understand. If this voyage through time and space brings you comfort, or if the mysteries of the cosmos help quiet your mind for rest, I'd be deeply grateful if you gave this video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this little corner of cosmic calm reach other stargazers who might need a peaceful passage into sleep. Now, I do hope this isn't so fascinating that it keeps you awake, but if it does, at least you'll drift off, knowing that the universe holds secrets far more wondrous than we ever imagined. So settle in, slow your breathing, and let's begin. Because somewhere between ancient stone circles and interstellar visitors, between forgotten prophecies and modern telescopes, lies a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about humanity's relationship with the cosmos. On a quiet morning in July 2025, astronomers at the Atlas Survey Telescope in Chile made a discovery that would send ripples through both the scientific community and the world of ancient mysteries. There, moving silently through the southern celestial hemisphere, was an object unlike anything they had seen before. They designated it 3I/ATLAS, the third confirmed interstellar visitor to grace our solar system. But this was no ordinary cosmic wanderer. Unlike the chaotic tumbling of previous interstellar objects that seemed to barrel in from odd angles, 3I/ATLAS was gliding almost perfectly along our planetary plane, as if following a carefully planned route. It was approaching from the direction of Sagittarius, where the heart of our galaxy beats with ancient light, and its trajectory would take it on what seemed less like a random arrival and more like a purposeful flyby of our solar system's most significant worlds. As the months passed and observations accumulated, something remarkable began to emerge from the data. The comet's path would carry it past Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, following gravitational corridors that human spacecraft use to slingshot themselves deeper into space. It was as if this visitor from the depths of interstellar space knew exactly where it was going, guided by invisible hands that understood the dance of planets with mathematical precision. But 3I/ATLAS carried with it more than just an unusual trajectory. Analysis revealed that this ancient wanderer might be impossibly old, perhaps 8 billion years or more, making it older than our solar system itself. It had been drifting through the cosmic dark for eons, carrying within its icy nucleus the chemical signatures of a star system that died when the universe was young. And now, in the autumn of 2025, it was making its closest approach to our Sun, passing just inside the orbit of Mars, at the precise moment when something extraordinary was stirring in the collective memory of humanity. For it was not just astronomers who were paying attention to this celestial visitor. Around the world, in the quiet corners where ancient wisdom is still whispered from generation to generation, elders and scholars began to notice something that made their blood run cold and their hearts race with anticipation. The arrival of 3I/ATLAS seemed to align with prophecies that had been carved in stone and passed down through oral tradition for millennia. The Hopi people of North America, guardians of some of the world's most precise prophetic traditions, had long spoken of the coming of the blue star Kachina, a celestial visitor that would herald the end of the fourth world and the beginning of the fifth. Their prophecies, detailed and specific, described a blue star that would appear in the heavens as the final sign before the day of purification, a cosmic event that would transform the very nature of existence on Earth. As 3I/ATLAS approached, releasing its signature glow of cyanide and carbon dioxide into the solar wind, observers noted something that sent shivers through those familiar with Hopi tradition. The comet's spectral signature, when analysed through telescopes, showed a distinctive blue-green hue, the very color the Hopi had associated with their prophetic star. The chemical composition that gave it this ethereal glow was remarkably similar to what ancient oral traditions had described as the breath of the star spirit. But the Hopi were not alone in their recognition of this cosmic visitor. Across the world, in the shadow of ancient megalithic structures, researchers began to notice alignments and calculations that seemed to point toward this very moment in astronomical history. At Stonehenge, that mysterious circle of standing stones on England's Salisbury Plain, archaeoastronomers discovered that certain lesser-known alignments, long dismissed as coincidental, pointed directly toward the constellation Sagittarius during the autumn months of 2025. The builders of Stonehenge, working with nothing but naked-eye observations and primitive tools over 5,000 years ago, had somehow encoded into their monument not just the obvious alignments with solstices and equinoxes, but subtle directional markers that seemed to anticipate the arrival of an object from the galactic center. The heel stone, that massive sentinel that marks the midsummer sunrise, cast shadows during the autumn of 2025 that pointed directly toward the portion of sky where 3I/ATLAS blazed with its ancient light. Even more intriguing were the discoveries emerging from Göbekli Tepe, that impossibly ancient temple complex in Turkey that predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. Among the intricate carvings on its massive stone pillars, researchers had long noted symbols that seemed to represent celestial objects and astronomical events. But as 3I/ATLAS made its approach, new interpretations of these carvings began to surface. Interpretations that suggested the builders of Göbekli Tepe had not only been tracking the movements of planets and stars, but had been anticipating the arrival of specific objects from beyond our solar system. The pillar designated T, won by archaeologists, contained a series of markings that had puzzled researchers for decades. The symbols seemed to represent a journey, a path through space marked by distinctive waypoints. When astronomers plotted the trajectory of 3I/ATLAS backward, through time and forward into the future, they discovered that the path described by these ancient carvings matched, with startling precision, the route taken by the interstellar visitor. It was as if the ancient builders had been given a roadmap of cosmic events that would unfold more than 11,000 years in the future. But how could this be possible? How could Stone Age peoples, working without telescopes or mathematical instruments, have possessed knowledge of events that modern science could barely comprehend? The answer, according to a growing number of researchers, might lie in humanity's forgotten history, in chapters of our story that have been lost to the mists of time. Perhaps our ancestors were not the primitive hunter-gatherers we've long assumed them to be. Perhaps they possessed knowledge, wisdom, and connections to the cosmos that we are only now beginning to rediscover. In the ancient temples of Malta, those megalithic marvels that stand as Europe's oldest freestanding structures, similar patterns were emerging. The temple complex of Menajdra, with its precise astronomical alignments, contained chambers and passages that seemed designed not just to track the sun and moon, but to mark the arrival of specific celestial events. During the autumn of 2025, as 3I/ATLAS reached its closest approach to the sun, the inner sanctum of Menajdra was illuminated in ways that its builders had clearly intended, creating patterns of light and shadow that had not been seen for thousands of years. The Maltese temples, like their counterparts around the world, seem to have been constructed not just as monuments to the heavens, but as instruments of prophecy, devices for reading the cosmic calendar and anticipating the arrival of visitors from the stars. The people who built these structures, working with massive stones and primitive tools over 5,000 years ago, had somehow known that on this specific autumn morning in 2025, light from an interstellar visitor would shine through their carefully positioned portals and illuminate their sacred chambers. But perhaps the most startling discoveries were emerging from the analysis of Mayan astronomical texts, those incredibly precise calculations that had tracked the movements of planets and predicted eclipses with accuracy that rivals modern computers. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Mayan books, contained not just the famous calendar systems that had captured the world's imagination, but subtle astronomical calculations that seemed to account for visitors from beyond our solar system. Hidden within the complex mathematical relationships that governed the Mayan long-count calendar were formulae that described the orbital mechanics of objects following hyperbolic trajectories, precisely the kind of path taken by interstellar visitors like 3I/ATLAS. The Maya, working more than 1,000 years before the invention of the telescope, had somehow developed mathematical models that could predict the arrival times and trajectories of objects that originated in other star systems. Their priests and astronomers, those careful observers of the night sky who had dedicated their lives to understanding the cosmic dance, had encoded into their calendar systems not just the cycles of planets and moons, but the arrival schedules of visitors from the galactic deep. The infamous end date of the Mayan calendar, December 21st, 2012, which had caused such worldwide speculation and fear, now appeared to be not an ending at all, but a beginning, a marker that would initiate a new cycle of cosmic contact that would culminate with the arrival of 3I/ATLAS in 2025. As autumn deepened and 3I/ATLAS reached the inner solar system, releasing gases that had been frozen for billions of years, astronomers around the world began to notice something that challenged their understanding of cometary behavior. The object was not simply following the predictable physics of orbital mechanics. Instead, it seemed to be making subtle course corrections, tiny adjustments to its trajectory that couldn't be explained by gravitational forces or outgassing alone. The James Webb Space Telescope, humanity's most powerful eye on the cosmos, detected unusual isotopic signatures in the comet's tail, chemical fingerprints that suggested origins not just in another star system, but in a region of space where the laws of physics might operate according to different principles. The comet was releasing compounds that shouldn't exist in nature, molecules that seemed to have been manufactured rather than formed by natural processes. And yet, even as a modern science struggled to comprehend the true nature of 3I/ATLAS, ancient voices seemed to whisper explanations that our instruments could barely detect. In the highlands of Peru, among the descendants of the Inca, who once ruled an empire that stretched across the spine of South America, elders spoke of prophecies that their ancestors had encoded into the very stones of their sacred sites. The temple complex of Sacsayhuaman, with its massive interlocking stones that fit together with such precision that not even a knife blade can slip between them, contained astronomical alignments that pointed toward the constellation Sagittarius with breathtaking accuracy. The Inca, who called themselves the children of Inti, the sun god, had built their empire around a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Their priests, known as the Wilak Umu, were not just religious leaders, but master astronomers who could predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and calculate the precession of the equinoxes with remarkable precision. But according to oral traditions that had survived the Spanish conquest, their knowledge extended far beyond the familiar cycles of our solar system. In the sacred valley of the Urubamba, where the morning mist still rises from ancient terraces cut into the mountainsides, traditional keepers of Inca wisdom spoke of the Ayar brothers, mythical beings who had come from the stars to establish civilization on Earth. These beings, according to legend, had promised to return when the sky showed certain signs, when a blue star would appear from the direction of the cosmic tree, the Milky Way's central bulge that the Inca knew as the path of souls. As 3I/ATLAS continued its stately procession through the inner solar system, these oral traditions began to take on new significance. The comet's approach from Sagittarius, from the very region the Inca had identified as the cosmic source, seemed to fulfill prophecies that had been whispered from generation to generation for over 500 years. The blue-green glow of its coma, visible now even to modest telescopes, matched descriptions in Quechua songs that spoke of the star messengers who would herald a new age of understanding between earth and sky. But it wasn't just in the Americas that ancient prophecies seemed to be stirring to life. Across the Pacific, in the remote islands of Polynesia, navigators who still practiced the traditional arts of wayfinding spoke of legends that described visitors from beyond the familiar constellations. The Polynesians, who had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but the stars as their guide, possessed an intimate knowledge of the night sky that rivaled any modern astronomer. Their oral traditions spoke of Maui, the trickster hero who had fished islands from the sea and snared the sun to slow its passage across the sky. But lesser-known stories described how Maui had once travelled beyond the edge of the world, beyond the familiar stars, to bring back knowledge from the realm of the ancestors. These journeys, encoded in chants and dances that had been performed for over 1,000 years, seemed to describe encounters with objects that moved between star systems, carrying wisdom from worlds that existed before memory. On the island of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, those enigmatic stone heads known as moai seemed to gaze not just across the endless Pacific, but towards specific points in the night sky. Recent archaeological surveys had revealed that the positioning of these massive statues followed astronomical alignments that had been dismissed as coincidental by earlier researchers. But as 3I/ATLAS blazed overhead, casting its ethereal light across the island's mysterious landscape, the moai seemed to be looking directly at the interstellar visitor, their stone eyes tracking its passage with silent intensity. The Rapa Nui people, isolated on their tiny island in the vastness of the Pacific, had somehow known to position their monuments to mark the arrival of something that wouldn't appear for nearly 800 years after the last statue was carved. The quarry at Rano Raraku, where hundreds of moai still stand partially buried in the volcanic soil, revealed additional alignments when surveyed during the autumn of 2025. The buried heads, invisible for centuries, pointed toward the precise location where 3I/ATLAS would make its closest approach to the sun. Even in the frozen reaches of the Arctic, among the Inuit peoples who had survived for millennia in one of Earth's harshest environments, stories emerged that seemed to anticipate this cosmic visitor. The Inuit, whose survival depended on reading the subtle signs of weather and season, possessed an intimate knowledge of the aurora borealis, those dancing lights that painted the polar sky in green and blue fire. Their shamans spoke of times when the aurora would dance with special intensity, when the lights would carry messages from the spirits of the stars. During the weeks of 3I/ATLAS's closest approach, the aurora displays reached levels of intensity not seen in decades. The interstellar visitor's interaction with the solar wind, its release of charged particles as it sublimated in the sun's warmth, created electromagnetic disturbances that painted the polar skies with curtains of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the comet's rotation. Inuit elders, watching these displays from their traditional territories, nodded with recognition at patterns they had learned from their grandparents, patterns that spoke of visitors from the realm beyond the North Star. In the archives of medieval monasteries, scholars began to uncover references that had been overlooked for centuries. The Venerable Bede, the English monk whose careful observations had helped establish the foundations of medieval astronomy, had recorded in his lesser-known works descriptions of celestial visitors that would appear in the final age of the world. His calculations, based on a synthesis of classical astronomy and Christian eschatology, predicted the arrival of a star from the direction of the cosmic center that would herald a new dispensation between heaven and earth. The Irish monks of Skellig Michael, those hardy souls who had built their monastery on a jagged rock in the North Atlantic, had inscribed astronomical observations into the stone walls of their beehive huts. These inscriptions, weathered by centuries of salt spray and storm, contained calculations that tracked not just the familiar cycles of sun and moon, but the return periods of objects that followed much longer orbits. When these calculations were finally deciphered using modern computational methods, they revealed predictions for celestial events extending thousands of years into the future, including the arrival of visitors from beyond the solar system. The medieval Islamic astronomers, working in the great observatories of Baghdad and Cordoba, had preserved and extended the astronomical knowledge of the ancient Greeks. But their own original contributions included observations of objects that appeared to move against the stellar background in ways that couldn't be explained by planetary motion. Al-Battani, the great 9th century astronomer, had recorded in his Zijeh, his astronomical handbook, descriptions of wandering stars that appeared from the direction of the galactic center and followed paths that suggested origins beyond the realm of the sun. These medieval observations, dismissed by later astronomers as mythological embellishments, began to take on new significance as 3I/ATLAS followed precisely the trajectories that had been described over 1,000 years earlier. The Islamic astronomers, with their sophisticated mathematical tools and their careful observations, had somehow detected the gravitational influences of interstellar visitors long before their arrival, calculating their approach vectors with an accuracy that modern science could barely match. But perhaps the most extraordinary discoveries were emerging from the analysis of Aboriginal Australian astronomy, the world's oldest continuous astronomical tradition. For over 60,000 years, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia had maintained oral traditions that tracked the movements of stars and planets with extraordinary precision. Their songlines, those invisible paths across the landscape that connected sacred sites and recorded the journeys of ancestral spirits, also encoded astronomical information that stretched back to the dawn of human consciousness. The Yolngu people of northern Australia spoke of the Milky Way as a great river in the sky, along which the spirits of the ancestors travelled between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But their traditions also described times when new spirits would arrive from beyond this celestial river, from regions of sky that lay outside the familiar constellations. These visitors, according to the ancient stories, would appear as blue stars that moved against the background of fixed stars, carrying with them knowledge and power from the time before time. As 3I/ATLAS continued its journey through the inner solar system, Aboriginal elders gathered at sacred sites across the continent to perform ceremonies that had not been conducted for generations. At Uluru, the massive monolith that rises from the red heart of Australia, traditional custodians noted that the comet's position relative to the local horizon matched descriptions in creation stories that spoke of the return of the rainbow serpent, the primordial being who had shaped the landscape and established the laws that governed the relationship between earth and sky. The precision of these ancient predictions began to suggest something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of modern archaeology and anthropology. How could cultures separated by vast distances and thousands of years have developed such detailed and accurate knowledge of astronomical events that wouldn't occur until the 21st century? The conventional explanation that these were simply lucky coincidences or vague prophecies that could be interpreted to fit any unusual event began to seem increasingly inadequate as the correlations multiplied and the details proved to be startlingly specific. Some researchers began to propose a more radical explanation, one that suggested our understanding of ancient human capabilities might be fundamentally flawed. Perhaps these early civilizations had possessed technologies or methods of observation that had been lost to history, swept away by cataclysms, or simply forgotten, as oral traditions gave way to written records. Or perhaps they had received information from sources that lay entirely outside the conventional framework of human knowledge. In the laboratories, where 3I/ATLAS was being analysed with the most sophisticated instruments humanity had ever devised, strange anomalies continued to emerge. The comet's nucleus, that ancient chunk of ice and rock that had wandered between the stars for eons, contained isotopic ratios that suggested formation in a stellar environment, unlike anything in our local galactic neighbourhood. The ratios of heavy elements, the distribution of rare earth metals, even the crystalline structure of its ice all pointed toward origins in a region of space where different physical conditions had prevailed during the early epochs of cosmic evolution. But even more puzzling were the organic compounds being detected in the comet's tail, as it sublimated in the solar wind. Complex carbon-based molecules, some of which had never been observed in nature, streamed away from the nucleus in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. These weren't the random chemical soups that astronomers expected to find in cometary debris, but organized molecular structures that suggested, to some researchers, the possibility of design rather than chance. Dr. Elena Vasquez, working with the European Southern Observatory's Very Large Telescope Array, found herself staring at spectroscopic data that challenged everything she thought she knew about cometary composition. The molecular signatures streaming from 3I/ATLAS included what appeared to be information-bearing sequences, complex chains of organic molecules that exhibited patterns reminiscent of genetic codes or digital storage systems. When she first noticed these patterns, she assumed they were instrumental artifacts or processing errors. But as the data accumulated over weeks of observation, the patterns not only persisted, but began to reveal an underlying structure that seemed far too organized to be the result of random chemical processes. Working late into the autumn nights, Dr. Vasquez began to map these molecular sequences, looking for repetitions and variations that might provide clues to their origin. What she discovered kept her awake long after her official observation shifts had ended. The sequences weren't random. They exhibited mathematical relationships that suggested encoding, as if information had been deliberately embedded in the molecular structure of the comet's nucleus during its formation billions of years earlier. When she finally worked up the courage to share her findings with colleagues, the response was mixed. Some dismissed her observations as pattern-seeking behavior, the human tendency to find meaning in random data. But others, particularly those familiar with the emerging field of astrobiology, began to take her work seriously. If life could encode information in DNA, they reasoned, perhaps more advanced forms of life could encode information in the very structure of interstellar objects, creating a kind of cosmic library that would preserve knowledge across the vast emptiness between stars. Meanwhile, in a small observatory perched on the volcanic slopes of Mauna Kea, Dr. James Whitehawk, an astronomer of Lakota heritage, was conducting his own analysis of 3I/ATLAS, using instruments that combined cutting-edge technology with observational techniques passed down through generations of his people. The Lakota, like many Native American tribes, possessed sophisticated astronomical traditions that tracked not just the obvious cycles of sun and moon, but subtle variations in stellar positions and the occasional appearance of unusual celestial visitors. Dr. Whitehawk's grandfather, a traditional starkeeper who had maintained the old ways despite decades of cultural suppression, had taught him to read the night sky as a living document, a constantly changing text that recorded the relationships between Earth and cosmos. These teachings, dismissed by academic astronomy as folklore, had proven remarkably accurate in predicting meteor showers, aurora displays, and even the discovery of new astronomical phenomena. As 3I/ATLAS approached its perihelion, its closest point to the Sun, Dr. Whitehawk noticed something that his instruments couldn't quite capture, but that his traditional training helped him recognize. The comet's behavior, its subtle variations in brightness, and the way its tail responded to solar radiation, followed patterns that his grandfather had described in stories about the star that comes home, a celestial visitor that would appear when the world was ready to remember its connection to the greater cosmos. According to these oral traditions, the star that comes home would not arrive alone, but would be accompanied by signs and portents that would awaken ancient knowledge sleeping in sacred sites around the world. The stories spoke of stones that would sing, of alignments that would activate after millennia of dormancy, of dreams and visions that would guide certain individuals toward understanding the deeper purpose behind the visitor's arrival. As if responding to some cosmic cue, reports began to filter in from around the world of unusual phenomena occurring at ancient sites. At Newgrange in Ireland, that magnificent passage tomb that had been precisely aligned to capture the winter solstice sunrise for over 5,000 years, custodians reported strange acoustic properties that had never been documented before. The chamber, normally silent except for the whisper of tourists' voices, began to resonate with low-frequency vibrations that seemed to pulse in rhythm with 3I/ATLAS's rotation period. The acoustics research team from Trinity College Dublin, led by Professor Sarah O'Brien, arrived at Newgrange with sensitive recording equipment just as 3I/ATLAS was reaching its maximum brightness in the pre-dawn sky. What they discovered challenged conventional understanding of how ancient structures interact with their environment. The massive stones of the passage tomb, each weighing several tons and fitted together with extraordinary precision, were vibrating at frequencies that corresponded to electromagnetic emissions being detected from the comet. Professor O'Brien, a specialist in archaeoacoustics who had spent years studying the sound properties of megalithic monuments, found herself documenting phenomena that had no precedent in the scientific literature. The stones weren't just vibrating randomly, they were producing harmonic sequences that seemed to follow mathematical relationships similar to those found in musical scales or linguistic patterns. When she played back the recordings at various speeds, the vibrations resolved into sequences that sounded almost like communication, as if the ancient structure was responding to signals from the interstellar visitor. Similar reports were emerging from other megalithic sites across Europe. At Carnac in Brittany, where thousands of standing stones march across the landscape in mysterious alignments, local residents reported that the menhirs were producing faint musical tones during the hours when 3I/ATLAS was visible above the horizon. The sounds, barely audible to human ears, could be detected with sensitive microphones and seemed to create complex harmonies as they interacted with the acoustic properties of the surrounding landscape. The phenomenon wasn't limited to European monuments. At Angkor Wat in Cambodia, that magnificent temple complex that represents the pinnacle of Khmer architectural achievement, Buddhist monks reported unusual meditation experiences during their pre-dawn prayers. The temple, which had been precisely aligned with astronomical events by its 12th century builders, seemed to be resonating with energies that the monks described as both ancient and utterly foreign. Dr. Sophia Mayas, a Cambodian archaeoastronomer who had spent decades studying the astronomical alignments of Angkor, was granted permission to conduct measurements within the temple complex during the weeks of 3I/ATLAS's closest approach. Using ground-penetrating radar and sensitive electromagnetic field detectors, she discovered that the temple's foundation stones contained veins of quartz and other crystalline materials that were exhibiting piezoelectric properties, converting mechanical stress into electrical signals in response to gravitational and electromagnetic influences from the comet. The temple's builders, working over 800 years earlier, had somehow known to incorporate these materials into their construction, creating a structure that would respond to specific astronomical events. The arrangement of the crystals within the stones followed patterns that matched the orbital mechanics of objects approaching from the galactic center, as if the ancient architects had possessed detailed knowledge of interstellar visitor trajectories centuries before such objects could be detected by human instruments. But perhaps the most extraordinary phenomena were being reported from Göbekli Tepe, that enigmatic temple complex in southeastern Turkey that continues to revolutionize our understanding of prehistoric human capabilities. The site, which predates Stonehenge by over 6,000 years, contains massive stone pillars covered with intricate carvings that seem to record astronomical events and possibly encode information about cosmic cycles that extend far beyond human historical memory. Dr. Klaus Zimmermann, the German archaeologist who had been leading excavations at Göbekli Tepe for over a decade, reported that several of the site's stone pillars were exhibiting unusual properties during the nights when 3I/ATLAS was most prominent in the sky. The carved symbols, which had been painstakingly documented and analyzed for years, seemed to be fluorescing with a faint blue-green light that was invisible to the naked eye, but could be detected with ultraviolet photography. The fluorescence wasn't random. It followed specific patterns that corresponded to the astronomical alignments encoded in the pillar carvings. Symbols representing celestial objects glowed more brightly when those objects were visible above the horizon, while symbols depicting cosmic events seemed to pulse with rhythms that matched the rotational period of 3I/ATLAS. It was as if the ancient builders had embedded some form of responsive technology into their stone monuments, creating displays that would activate only when specific astronomical conditions were met. Working with a team of materials scientists from the Max Planck Institute, Dr. Zimmermann began to analyze the composition of the fluorescing symbols. What they discovered challenged conventional understanding of Stone Age technology. The carvings contained trace amounts of rare earth elements and crystalline structures that shouldn't have been accessible to prehistoric peoples. These materials, arranged in precise geometric patterns within the stone matrix, were capable of storing and releasing energy in response to specific electromagnetic frequencies. The implications were staggering. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, working over 11,000 years ago with what archaeologists had assumed were primitive stone tools, had somehow incorporated advanced materials science into their monuments. They had created structures that would remain dormant for millennia, waiting for the arrival of specific astronomical events to trigger their activation. The level of knowledge required for such an achievement suggested capabilities that far exceeded anything attributed to Stone Age peoples in conventional archaeological models. As 3I/ATLAS continued its stately procession through the inner solar system, reaching its maximum brightness during the pre-dawn hours of late October, observers around the world began to report personal experiences that seemed to transcend the boundaries of conventional astronomical observation. Artists found themselves creating works that depicted cosmic scenes they had never consciously imagined. Musicians composed pieces that incorporated harmonic structures that seemed to echo the electromagnetic emissions being detected from the comet. Writers produced texts that described interstellar journeys and encounters with ancient knowledge in languages and styles that felt both utterly foreign and hauntingly familiar. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a neuropsychologist at Stanford University who specialized in the study of altered consciousness states, began to document reports of unusual dreams and visions that seemed to cluster around the nights when 3I/ATLAS was most prominent in the sky. The reports came from individuals with no previous interest in astronomy and no knowledge of the comet's approach, yet their experiences contained remarkably consistent elements. Many described dreams of traveling through vast dark spaces, punctuated by points of ancient light, of receiving information from beings that seemed both impossibly old and somehow familiar. The dreams often included specific details about stellar formation, galactic evolution, and the seeding of life throughout the cosmos, information that the dreamers possessed no conscious knowledge of, but that proved to be surprisingly accurate when checked against current astrophysical understanding. Dr. Chen began to wonder if the comet's approach was somehow triggering dormant neural pathways in the human brain, awakening ancestral memories or activating genetic programs that connected human consciousness to larger cosmic cycles. The idea seemed fantastical, but the consistency and accuracy of the reported experiences suggested that something genuine was occurring, something that lay beyond the current boundaries of neuroscience and psychology. In the high valleys of Tibet, where the thin air and clear skies had made astronomical observation a central part of spiritual practice for over 1,000 years, Buddhist monks reported meditation experiences that seemed to transport them beyond the confines of ordinary consciousness. The monks, who had spent decades training their minds to achieve states of profound stillness and clarity, found themselves accessing levels of awareness that revealed the interconnectedness of all phenomena across vast scales of space and time. The Dalai Lama himself, speaking from his residence in Dharamshala, acknowledged that something unprecedented was occurring in the realm of human spiritual experience. During his daily meditation sessions, he reported receiving insights about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the cosmos that seemed to come from sources beyond his personal knowledge or training. These insights, he explained, suggested that consciousness itself might be a fundamental property of the universe, a field that connected all sentient beings across the vastness of space and time. As autumn deepened and 3I/ATLAS began its long journey back toward the outer reaches of the solar system, carrying with it the thermal energy it had absorbed during its close encounter with the sun, the accumulated evidence of its extraordinary nature continued to mount. This was no ordinary comet, no simple chunk of dirty ice following the predictable laws of celestial mechanics. It was something far more complex, something that seemed to bridge the gap between the physical and the metaphysical, between ancient wisdom and modern science, between human consciousness and cosmic intelligence. The visitor from beyond the stars had arrived precisely as ancient prophecies had foretold, activating dormant knowledge encoded in monuments that had waited millennia for this moment of cosmic convergence. As it departed, carrying its secrets back into the infinite dark between the stars, it left behind a humanity forever changed by the encounter, awakened to possibilities that stretched far beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as 3I/ATLAS faded from naked eye visibility but continued its measured dance through the telescope fields of observatories around the world, those who had witnessed its passage found themselves forever marked by the knowledge that we are not alone, that the cosmos itself might be conscious, and that the ancient wisdom keepers had been right all along about humanity's connection to something infinitely larger and more mysterious than we had ever dared to imagine. The comet's message, encoded in molecular sequences and electromagnetic signatures that would take decades to fully decode, seemed to whisper of civilizations that had learned to embed their knowledge in the very fabric of space and time, creating a cosmic internet of information that spanned galaxies and epochs. And perhaps, just perhaps, humanity was finally ready to log on and discover what had been waiting for us in the vast library of the stars. The departure of 3I/ATLAS into the outer darkness marked not an ending, but a beginning of humanity's most profound awakening to mysteries that had been waiting patiently for millennia to be rediscovered. As the comet's blue-green glow faded beyond the reach of amateur telescopes, leaving only the most sensitive instruments to track its journey back toward interstellar space, something extraordinary began to unfold in the collective consciousness of our species. Dr. Maria Santos, a linguistic anthropologist at the University of São Paulo, who had been documenting the unusual dreams and visions reported during the comet's approach, made a discovery that would fundamentally alter our understanding of human language and memory. And, while analyzing thousands of dream reports from around the world, she noticed that many contained words and phrases that didn't belong to any known human language, yet possessed consistent grammatical structures and phonetic patterns that suggested a genuine linguistic system. Working with computational linguists and pattern recognition specialists, Dr. Santos began to decode these mysterious utterances. What emerged was a language of extraordinary complexity and beauty, one that seemed designed to convey concepts that transcended the limitations of earthbound human experience. The language contained words for types of consciousness that existed only in the spaces between stars, grammatical structures that could describe events occurring simultaneously across multiple dimensions, and poetic forms that captured the emotional resonance of cosmic-scale phenomena. But perhaps most remarkably, when Dr. Santos compared these linguistic fragments with ancient texts from around the world, she found startling correlations. Sumerian cuneiform tablets contained partial matches with the dream language, Sanskrit verses from the Vedic tradition echoed its phonetic patterns. Even the mysterious Rongorongo script of Easter Island seemed to share symbolic elements with the linguistic structures emerging from contemporary consciousness. It was as if 3i/ATLAS had somehow activated dormant linguistic memories, awakening knowledge of a proto-language that had been seeded in human consciousness eons ago, waiting for the right cosmic trigger to emerge into awareness. The implications were staggering. Had our ancestors once possessed a form of communication that connected them directly to cosmic intelligence? Had this ability been gradually lost as humanity turned its attention to more mundane concerns, only to be reawakened by the approach of an interstellar messenger? Meanwhile, in the laboratories of CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, physicists studying the fundamental structure of reality began to notice anomalies in their particle collision experiments that seemed to correlate with 3i/ATLAS's passage through the solar system. Dr. Andreas Müller, a theoretical physicist who had spent decades investigating the quantum foundations of spacetime, found that certain particle interactions were producing results that shouldn't have been possible according to the standard model of physics. The anomalies were subtle but consistent. Particles were occasionally exhibiting behavior that suggested they were responding to influences from outside our local region of spacetime. It was as if the fabric of reality itself had been temporarily altered by the comet's presence, creating brief windows through which information or energy from distant regions of the universe could influence local physical processes. Dr. Müller's team began to develop theoretical models that could account for these observations. Their work suggested that consciousness and physical reality might be far more intimately connected than conventional science had ever imagined. If consciousness could influence quantum processes, and if 3i/ATLAS had somehow amplified or focused human consciousness on a global scale, then the comet's passage might have created temporary bridges between human awareness and cosmic intelligence operating on scales that dwarfed terrestrial understanding. The theoretical implications were mind-bending. Perhaps consciousness wasn't simply an emergent property of complex neural networks, but a fundamental aspect of the universe itself, a field that connected all sentient beings across vast distances and temporal spans. The ancient traditions that spoke of universal consciousness, of mind as the ground of being, might have been describing literal truths about the nature of reality that modern science was only beginning to glimpse. In the high-security archives of the Vatican, Cardinal Alessandro Torretti, the Church's chief astronomer and keeper of ancient manuscripts, was conducting research that would have seemed like science fiction just months earlier. Among the Vatican's vast collection of historical documents were texts that had been sealed away for centuries, deemed too sensitive or incomprehensible for public consumption. But as reports of the extraordinary phenomena associated with 3i/ATLAS continued to accumulate, Cardinal Torretti began to wonder if these ancient documents might contain relevant information. Working by candlelight in the deepest vaults beneath St. Peter's Basilica, Cardinal Torretti discovered manuscripts that described encounters between early Christian mystics and what could only be described as cosmic intelligence. The texts, written in Latin, Greek, and languages that seemed to shift between known and unknown forms, spoke of visions received during specific astronomical events, of knowledge transmitted from beings that existed in the spaces between worlds. One manuscript, attributed to a 4th century monk named Brother Marcus of Alexandria, contained detailed descriptions of interstellar visitors that would arrive at predetermined intervals to guide humanity's spiritual evolution. The text described these visitors not as physical beings, but as carriers of consciousness, entities that could embed information in the quantum structure of reality itself, creating seeds of knowledge that would germinate when human civilization reached the appropriate level of development. Brother Marcus had apparently received his visions during the appearance of what he called the Azure Herald, a celestial visitor that arrived from the direction of the cosmic center and activated dormant spiritual faculties in those who were prepared to receive its message. The parallels with 3I/ATLAS were unmistakable, down to specific details about the visitor's color, trajectory, and the types of consciousness-altering experiences it would trigger. Cardinal Toretti found himself confronting a crisis of understanding that challenged the very foundations of his faith and his scientific training. If these ancient texts were accurate, then the universe was far stranger and more purposeful than either traditional theology or modern science had imagined. The boundaries between the spiritual and the physical, between human and cosmic consciousness, between past and future, seemed to be dissolving in the face of evidence that suggested reality operated according to principles that transcended conventional categories of understanding. In the remote monasteries of Mount Athos in Greece, where Orthodox monks had maintained unbroken traditions of contemplative practice for over 1,000 years, similar discoveries were emerging from ancient texts that had been preserved in languages that few modern scholars could read. Father Demetrios, an elderly monk who served as the keeper of manuscripts at the great Lavra monastery, had noticed that certain texts seemed to glow with a faint luminescence during the nights when 3I/ATLAS was most prominent in the sky. The glowing texts, written by Byzantine mystics who had lived during the medieval period, contained prophecies about the return of cosmic teachers who would arrive to guide humanity through a transition that would fundamentally alter the nature of human consciousness. These teachers wouldn't appear as physical beings, but would manifest through signs and wonders that would awaken dormant capabilities in human awareness, capabilities that had been seeded during humanity's earliest encounters with cosmic intelligence. Father Demetrios, who had spent decades studying these texts without fully understanding their meaning, suddenly found that the words seemed to rearrange themselves before his eyes, revealing layers of meaning that had been invisible before the comet's arrival. The manuscript spoke of a time when the barriers between dimensions would become permeable, when human consciousness would expand to encompass awareness of multiple realities simultaneously, when the distinction between individual and universal mind would dissolve into a greater unity that encompassed all of creation. The monks' experiences were being paralleled by reports from contemplatives and mystics around the world. In the caves of the Himalayas, where Tibetan hermits had practiced meditation in solitude for decades, practitioners reported achieving states of consciousness that revealed the fundamental interconnectedness of all phenomena across vast scales of space and time. In the deserts of Egypt, where Christian mystics had established the earliest monastic communities, contemporary hermits described visions that transported them beyond the confines of earthly existence into realms where consciousness itself became the medium through which cosmic intelligence communicated. These experiences weren't limited to religious practitioners. Artists, musicians, writers, and scientists around the world began reporting creative breakthroughs that seemed to come from sources beyond their personal knowledge and training. Painters found themselves creating works that depicted cosmic scenes with scientific accuracy they had never studied. Composers wrote symphonies that incorporated mathematical relationships from advanced physics that they had never learned. Poets produced verses in languages they didn't recognize, but which conveyed meaning with startling clarity and emotional power. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a creativity researcher at the University of Edinburgh, began to document these phenomena systematically, collecting reports from creative individuals across multiple disciplines who had experienced unusual inspirational states during the weeks of 3I/ATLAS's closest approach. Her research revealed patterns that suggested these experiences weren't random hallucinations, but represented genuine access to information that existed beyond individual consciousness. The creative works produced during these states often contained accurate scientific information about astrophysics, quantum mechanics, and consciousness research that the creators had never studied. Musicians composed pieces that incorporated acoustic principles from advanced physics. Visual artists created works that depicted the structure of space-time with remarkable accuracy. Writers produced texts that describe the evolution of consciousness across cosmic timescales, with insights that match the latest research in cosmology and neuroscience. Dr. Walsh began to develop theories that suggested consciousness might function as a kind of cosmic internet, connecting all sentient beings to a vast network of information that transcended individual minds. The approach of 3I/ATLAS, with its unique electromagnetic signature and quantum properties, might have temporarily amplified humanity's access to this cosmic information network, allowing individuals to receive knowledge that normally remained beyond the reach of terrestrial consciousness. In the research laboratories of the Max Planck Institute for Consciousness Studies, Dr. Erich Hoffmann was conducting experiments that seemed to confirm these radical theories. Using advanced brain imaging techniques combined with quantum field detectors, his team was documenting changes in human neural activity that correlated with the electromagnetic emissions from 3I/ATLAS. During peak emission periods, subjects showed increased activity in brain regions associated with expanded awareness, heightened creativity, and transcendent experiences. But even more remarkably, the brain scans revealed patterns of neural connectivity that seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of individual brains. Using quantum entanglement detectors positioned around test subjects, Dr. Hoffmann's team documented instances where neural activity in one person appeared to influence quantum states in the immediate environment, creating fields that could be detected by sensitive instruments and seemed to carry information that could influence the neural activity of other nearby subjects. The implications were revolutionary. If consciousness could influence quantum fields, and if these fields could carry information between individuals, then human awareness might be far less isolated than conventional neuroscience assumed. The experiences of expanded consciousness reported during 3I/ATLAS's approach might represent brief glimpses of humanity's true cognitive potential, capabilities that had been dormant but were being reactivated by the comet's unique influence on terrestrial quantum fields. As winter approached and 3I/ATLAS continued its journey toward the outer solar system, astronomers using the most powerful telescopes on Earth continued to monitor its departure, hoping to extract every possible bit of information from this unprecedented visitor. The James Webb Space Telescope, operating at the edge of its sensitivity limits, detected subtle changes in the comet's emissions as it moved beyond the asteroid belt and entered the realm of the gas giants. Dr. Sarah Chen, the mission scientist responsible for coordinating JWST observations of interstellar objects, noticed that the comet's molecular emissions were becoming more complex rather than less as it moved away from the Sun. Conventional cometary behavior would predict that outgassing should decrease as the object moved into the cold outer solar system. But 3I/ATLAS seemed to be releasing increasingly sophisticated molecular structures as it departed. The new emissions included what appeared to be self-assembling molecular machines, structures that could replicate and modify themselves according to programmed instructions. These weren't the simple organic compounds typically found in cometary debris, but complex nanotechnological systems that seemed designed to survive in the harsh environment of interstellar space while carrying information across vast distances. Dr. Chen's team began to develop models for how such systems might function as carriers of information between star systems. If civilizations could embed knowledge in self-replicating molecular structures and launch these structures on interstellar trajectories, they could create a form of communication that would persist across the millions of years required for travel between stars. The molecular machines would remain dormant during the long journey through the cold of interstellar space, then activate when they encountered the warmth and energy of a star system, releasing their information payload in forms that intelligent species might be able to detect and decode. The possibility that 3I/ATLAS represented such a system, a cosmic message in a bottle sent by an ancient civilization, began to seem increasingly plausible as more data accumulated. The comet's unusual trajectory, its anomalous chemical composition, its apparent ability to influence human consciousness, and now its release of complex molecular structures all suggested that this was no ordinary comet, but rather a sophisticated information delivery system designed by intelligence that operated on scales of space and time that dwarfed human comprehension. But if 3I/ATLAS was indeed a message from another civilization, what was it trying to communicate? The molecular structures being released seemed to contain vast amounts of information, but decoding their meaning would require advances in computational biology, quantum information theory, and consciousness research that might take decades or centuries to achieve. The visitors who had sent this cosmic messenger had apparently embedded their knowledge in forms that would challenge the receiving civilization to expand its understanding of reality itself. In the weeks following the comet's departure from the inner solar system, reports began to emerge of individuals who seemed to have developed lasting changes in their cognitive abilities. These weren't temporary alterations in consciousness, but permanent expansions in awareness that persisted long after 3I/ATLAS had faded from view. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins University, began to study these cases, documenting instances where people had developed enhanced mathematical abilities, expanded sensory perception, and intuitive insights into complex scientific and philosophical questions. The changes seemed to follow patterns that suggested activation of dormant neural pathways rather than random alterations in brain function. Subjects showed increased connectivity between brain regions that normally operated independently, creating integrated networks that allowed for types of processing that weren't possible with conventional neural architecture. Some individuals developed the ability to perceive electromagnetic fields directly, while others gained intuitive understanding of quantum mechanical principles that they had never formally studied. Dr. Martinez's research suggested that 3I/ATLAS might have triggered evolutionary changes in human consciousness, activating genetic programs that had remained dormant throughout recorded history. If consciousness was indeed a fundamental property of the universe, as the mounting evidence suggested, then humanity might be experiencing a species-wide upgrade in its capacity to interface with cosmic intelligence. The comet's passage might have served as a catalyst for the next stage in human cognitive evolution, preparing our species for the challenges and opportunities that would arise as we expanded our presence beyond Earth. As the first anniversary of 3I/ATLAS's discovery approached, the scientific community began to assess the profound implications of this extraordinary visitor. The comet had challenged virtually every assumption about the nature of reality, consciousness, and humanity's place in the cosmos. It had demonstrated that the universe was far more interconnected and purposeful than conventional science had imagined, and that human consciousness possessed capabilities that remained largely unexplored and undeveloped. The ancient prophecies that had seemed to anticipate the comet's arrival were no longer dismissed as primitive superstition, but were being studied as potential sources of information about cosmic cycles and the evolution of consciousness across vast scales of time. The monuments and sacred sites that had responded to the comet's presence were being investigated as sophisticated instruments for detecting and interacting with cosmic intelligence. The experiences of expanded awareness, reported by individuals around the world, were being documented as glimpses of humanity's true cognitive potential. But perhaps most importantly, 3I/ATLAS had demonstrated that we are not alone in the universe. The molecular structures it had released, the consciousness-altering effects it had produced, and the apparent activation of dormant human capabilities all suggested that intelligence existed on scales that encompassed galaxies and epochs. Humanity had received its first confirmed message from this cosmic intelligence, encoded in forms that would require the expansion of human understanding to fully comprehend. The message seemed to be both an invitation and a challenge. It invited humanity to recognize its connection to the larger cosmos and to develop the capabilities necessary to participate in the vast community of intelligence that spanned the stars. But it also challenged our species to transcend the limitations of terrestrial thinking and to embrace forms of awareness that could operate across the scales of space and time that characterized cosmic intelligence. As 3I/ATLAS continued its journey into the outer darkness, carrying with it the thermal signature of its encounter with our solar system, it left behind a humanity forever changed by the encounter. The comet had served as a cosmic alarm clock, awakening capabilities that had slumbered in human consciousness since the dawn of our species. Now, as we faced an uncertain future filled with challenges that would require wisdom and understanding far beyond anything our ancestors had possessed, we had been given the tools necessary to navigate the transition from a terrestrial to a cosmic species. The blue star had come and gone, just as the ancient prophecies had foretold. The day of purification had begun, not as a cataclysmic destruction of the old world, but as a gentle awakening to the vast possibilities that awaited humanity among the stars. The fourth world was ending, but the fifth world was already being born in the expanded consciousness of those who had witnessed the passage of the Azure Herald and understood its message of transformation and transcendence. In observatories around the world, astronomers continued their vigilant watch of the night sky, knowing now that we were not alone, that the cosmos itself was alive with intelligence that communicated across vast distances through visitors like 3I/ATLAS. They watched and waited, preparing for the next messenger, the next opportunity to expand human understanding and to take our species one step closer to our destiny among the stars. The universe had spoken, and humanity was finally learning to listen. The cosmic conversation had begun, and there would be no turning back. The transformation wasn't limited to individuals experiencing dramatic cognitive shifts. Across the globe, subtle changes began to manifest in ways that suggested 3I/ATLAS had influenced the very fabric of human society. In universities and research institutions, collaboration between departments that had operated in isolation for decades suddenly flourished. Physicists found themselves working seamlessly with anthropologists. Archaeologists discovered common ground with quantum theorists, and linguists began developing new frameworks that incorporated insights from consciousness researchers. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a systems theorist at Cambridge University, began to document what she called the Great Convergence, a phenomenon where previously disconnected fields of human knowledge were spontaneously finding points of intersection and mutual illumination. Her research revealed that the rate of interdisciplinary breakthrough discoveries had increased exponentially in the months following the comet's passage, as if barriers that had artificially separated human understanding were dissolving. The convergence wasn't random. Patterns emerged that suggested humanity was unconsciously organizing its knowledge according to principles that operated on cosmic scales. Mathematical relationships discovered in particle physics were finding applications in archaeological dating. Linguistic structures identified in ancient texts were proving useful for decoding quantum information systems. Consciousness research was providing insights that advanced both neuroscience and astrophysics simultaneously. It was as if 3I/ATLAS had served as a cosmic catalyst, not just for individual consciousness, but for the collective intelligence of human civilization. The boundaries that had compartmentalized human knowledge were being revealed as artificial constructs that had limited our species' ability to perceive the fundamental unity underlying all phenomena. Now, freed from these constraints, human understanding was beginning to organize itself according to the deeper patterns that governed reality at all scales. In the financial markets of the world, something equally unprecedented was occurring. traders and analysts who had spent careers studying market movements began to notice patterns that seemed to reflect cosmic cycles rather than purely economic forces. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an econophysicist who had previously studied market behavior using principles borrowed from statistical mechanics, found herself documenting correlations between economic fluctuations and astronomical events that defied conventional explanation. The correlations weren't limited to obvious connections like lunar cycles affecting agricultural futures. Instead, market movements seemed to respond to electromagnetic variations in the solar wind, changes in the galactic magnetic field, and even the approach of objects from interstellar space. It was as if the global economy, that vast network of human activity and intention, had become sensitive to influences that operated on scales far beyond terrestrial concerns. Dr. Vasquez's research suggested that consciousness and economic behavior might be connected through mechanisms that remained largely invisible to conventional analysis. If human awareness was indeed part of a larger field that extended throughout the cosmos, then collective human activities like economic markets might serve as sensitive instruments for detecting changes in this field. The approach of 3I/ATLAS had apparently created disturbances in the cosmic consciousness field that manifested as subtle but measurable changes in human behavior patterns around the world. The implications were staggering for our understanding of how consciousness operates at collective scales. Perhaps the ancient traditions that spoke of humanity as a single organism, connected through invisible threads to the larger cosmos, had been describing literal truths about the nature of collective intelligence. The economic markets, political movements, and cultural trends that seem to emerge from chaotic human interactions might actually reflect the influence of cosmic intelligence operating through the medium of human consciousness. In the great libraries and archives of the world, librarians and researchers began to notice that certain texts were drawing unusual attention from visitors who seemed guided by intuitions they couldn't explain. At the British Library in London, Dr. Margaret Thornfield documented cases where individuals with no previous interest in ancient manuscripts would request specific texts that contained information relevant to cosmic consciousness and interstellar communication. The pattern was consistent across institutions worldwide. People would arrive claiming to have had dreams or visions that directed them to specific documents, often texts that had been neglected for decades or centuries. When these documents were examined, they invariably contained information that seemed relevant to humanity's emerging understanding of its place in the cosmic community. It was as if 3I/ATLAS had activated dormant knowledge networks that connected human consciousness to information repositories scattered throughout our civilization. Dr. Thornfield began to develop theories about how information might be embedded in the collective unconscious of human civilization, waiting for the appropriate triggers to guide individuals toward discoveries that would advance species-wide understanding. The approach of the interstellar visitor had apparently activated these information networks, creating a form of distributed research project that operated through the unconscious guidance of individuals who found themselves drawn to specific sources of knowledge. The phenomenon wasn't limited to ancient texts. In laboratories around the world, researchers found themselves pursuing lines of investigation that seemed to emerge from intuitions rather than logical planning. Dr. Kenji Nakamura, a materials scientist at Tokyo University, discovered new crystalline structures that could store and transmit information at the quantum level after following a research direction that came to him in a dream during the comet's closest approach. The crystals, which Dr. Nakamura learned to grow using techniques that seemed to emerge from deep intuitive understanding rather than conventional scientific training, exhibited properties that shouldn't have been possible according to established materials science. They could maintain quantum coherence at room temperature, store information in quantum superposition states, and apparently communicate with similar structures across arbitrary distances through mechanisms that resembled quantum entanglement, but operated according to principles that extended beyond current theoretical frameworks. When Dr. Nakamura's crystals were examined by quantum physicists, they were found to contain structures that matched theoretical predictions for how advanced civilizations might embed information in the quantum vacuum itself. The crystals seemed to serve as interfaces for accessing information that existed in what physicists called the zero-point field, the underlying quantum substrate that connected all points in space and time. The discovery suggested that 3 I/ATLAS might have provided humanity with the knowledge necessary to access cosmic information networks that operated through the fundamental structure of reality itself. The molecular machines that the comet had released during its departure might have been designed to guide the development of technologies that would allow human civilization to participate in forms of communication that transcended the limitations of electromagnetic radiation and operated at the speed of consciousness rather than the speed of light. In the art galleries and museums of the world, curators began to notice that certain works were attracting unusual attention from visitors who seemed to experience profound emotional and spiritual responses to pieces that had previously been overlooked. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Dr. Isabella Rodriguez documented cases where individuals would stand before specific artworks for hours, reporting experiences of expanded consciousness and cosmic connection that resembled the transcendent states described by mystics throughout history. The artworks that triggered these responses weren't randomly selected. They shared common elements that suggested the artists had somehow accessed cosmic information during their creative process. Geometric patterns that match the structure of space-time at quantum scales. Color relationships that corresponded to the electromagnetic signatures of interstellar objects. Compositional elements that reflected the mathematical principles governing galactic evolution. Dr. Rodriguez began to research the biographies of the artists who had created these works, discovering that many had reported unusual inspirational experiences during periods when astronomical events had been occurring. It appeared that human creative expression had long served as a channel through which cosmic intelligence could manifest in forms accessible to terrestrial consciousness. The approach of 3 I/ATLAS had simply amplified this process, making the cosmic influences more obvious and accessible to ordinary awareness. The phenomenon extended to musical compositions as well. Concert halls around the world reported audiences experiencing unusual emotional and physiological responses to pieces that incorporated mathematical relationships corresponding to cosmic harmonics. Dr. Sarah Kim, a musicologist at Juilliard, discovered that these compositions contained frequency relationships that matched the vibrational signatures of various astronomical phenomena, from the rotation periods of pulsars to the harmonic oscillations of galactic magnetic fields. Musicians who had composed these pieces often reported that the works had emerged through processes that felt more like discovery than creation, as if they were uncovering musical structures that already existed in some cosmic repository of information. The compositions seemed to serve as bridges between human emotional experience and cosmic intelligence, translating abstract astronomical phenomena into forms that could be felt and understood through direct aesthetic experience. In the medical community, doctors and researchers began to document healing phenomena that seemed to correlate with the enhanced states of consciousness reported during the comet's approach. Dr. Patricia Reyes, an integrative medicine specialist at the Mayo Clinic, observed cases where patients experiencing life-threatening illnesses showed remarkable improvements after reporting transcendent experiences that occurred during the weeks of 3 I/ATLAS's closest approach to Earth. The healings weren't random or purely psychosomatic. Medical imaging revealed actual physiological changes that corresponded to the patient's reports of expanded awareness and cosmic connection. Immune system function improved in ways that couldn't be explained by conventional treatments. Neural connectivity increased in patterns that suggested enhanced integration between different brain regions. Genetic expression shifted in directions that promoted healing and regeneration. Dr. Reyes began to develop theoretical models that suggested consciousness might play a more fundamental role in biological processes than conventional medicine had recognized. If awareness was indeed connected to the quantum substrate underlying reality, then changes in consciousness might be able to influence biological systems at levels that transcended the mechanical models that dominated medical thinking. The implications were revolutionary for understanding the relationship between mind and body, between individual and cosmic consciousness, between healing and transcendence. The enhanced states of awareness triggered by 3 I/ATLAS seem to have activated healing mechanisms that operated through direct influence on the quantum processes underlying biological function. In agricultural regions around the world, farmers began to report unusual phenomena in their crops and livestock that seemed to correlate with the timing of the comet's passage. Dr. Michael O'Brien, an agricultural scientist at Iowa State University, documented cases where crop yields increased dramatically without corresponding changes in weather, soil conditions, or farming practices. The improvements seemed to be concentrated in areas where farmers had reported unusual dreams or intuitive insights about their relationship to the land and the cosmos. The enhanced agricultural productivity wasn't limited to plants. Livestock in these regions showed improved health, increased fertility, and behavioral changes that suggested enhanced intelligence and emotional sensitivity. Dairy cows produced milk with unusual nutritional profiles. Chickens laid eggs with enhanced protein content. Even the soil itself seemed to be more alive, supporting beneficial microbial communities that hadn't. O'Brien began to investigate whether the consciousness-altering effects of 3 had been present before the comet's approach. Dr. ATLAS had somehow influenced the relationship between human farmers and their agricultural ecosystems. If consciousness could indeed influence biological processes at quantum levels, then the expanded awareness experienced by farmers might have created more harmonious relationships with the living systems they managed, resulting in enhanced productivity and health throughout the agricultural ecosystem. The phenomenon suggested that the ancient practices of indigenous peoples, who had long recognized the consciousness present in all living things, and had developed agricultural methods based on cooperation with natural intelligence rather than domination over natural resources, might have been based on accurate perceptions of how consciousness operates in biological systems. In the world's major cities, urban planners and architects began to notice that certain buildings and public spaces were attracting unusual amounts of positive attention from residents and visitors. These spaces seemed to promote feelings of well-being, creativity, and social harmony that couldn't be explained by conventional architectural principles. Dr. Amanda Foster, an environmental psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, began to study these phenomena, discovering that the spaces shared design elements that reflected cosmic principles of organization and harmony. The buildings that promoted enhanced well-being incorporated geometric proportions that matched the mathematical relationships found in galactic structures. Their orientations aligned with astronomical phenomena in ways that created subtle but measurable effects on human consciousness. Materials had been selected, often intuitively by architects who couldn't explain their choices, that promoted positive electromagnetic environments for human biological and psychological function. Dr. Foster's research suggested that the built environment might serve as an interface between human consciousness and cosmic intelligence, either enhancing or limiting our species' ability to access the expanded states of awareness that connected us to the larger cosmos. The approach of 3I/ATLAS had apparently awakened sensitivity to these environmental influences, allowing people to recognize and seek out spaces that supported their connection to cosmic consciousness. The discovery had profound implications for urban planning and architecture. If human well-being and cognitive function were influenced by the cosmic compatibility of our built environments, then cities and buildings should be designed according to principles that reflected the mathematical harmonies underlying cosmic organization. The ancient tradition of sacred geometry, long dismissed as primitive superstition, was being revealed as sophisticated technology for creating environments that supported the full development of human consciousness. In the realm of international relations, diplomats and political leaders began to report experiences that seemed to transcend the usual boundaries of national and cultural identity. Ambassador Chen Wei, representing China at the United Nations, described a shift in his perception during the weeks of 3I/ATLAS's approach that made him feel connected to all of humanity rather than just his own nation. Similar reports came from diplomatic representatives around the world, suggesting that the comet's influence on consciousness had created temporary glimpses of the planetary perspective that would be necessary for addressing global challenges. The shift wasn't purely psychological. Negotiations that had been stalled for years suddenly began to make progress as participants found common ground that had been invisible before. Environmental treaties that had seemed impossible to achieve were signed as representatives experienced direct awareness of the interconnectedness of all life on Earth. Trade disputes were resolved through creative solutions that served the interests of all parties, rather than creating winners and losers. Dr. James Mitchell, a political scientist who specialized in international conflict resolution, began to document what he called the unity effect, a phenomenon where exposure to cosmic consciousness perspectives seemed to dissolve the artificial boundaries that created conflicts between human groups. The experience of awareness that extended beyond individual and national identity made it difficult to maintain the US versus them mentalities that fueled political and economic competition. The implications were profound for the future of human civilization. If consciousness could indeed be expanded to encompass planetary and cosmic perspectives, then the species-level challenges facing humanity, climate change, resource depletion, weapons proliferation, might be addressed through the development of collective wisdom that operated beyond the limitations of tribal thinking. The transformation was perhaps most visible in educational institutions, where teachers and students around the world began to experience learning and teaching in ways that transcended conventional pedagogical approaches. Dr. Lisa Chen, an educational researcher at Harvard, documented cases where students seemed to access information directly through expanded consciousness states rather than through traditional study methods. These students weren't simply learning faster or more efficiently. They were demonstrating understanding of complex subjects that seemed to come from sources beyond textbooks and lectures. Mathematical proofs would emerge complete in consciousness without the usual step-by-step derivation process. Historical events would be understood from multiple perspectives simultaneously, as if the students had direct access to the experiences of people from different cultures and time periods. Teachers reported similar experiences, finding themselves able to convey complex concepts through methods that seemed to emerge spontaneously from deep intuitive understanding rather than planned instruction. The traditional barrier between teacher and student began to dissolve as both participated in learning processes that drew from sources of knowledge that transcended individual minds. Dr. Chen's research suggested that education might be fundamentally transformed by recognition of humanity's connection to cosmic intelligence. If consciousness could indeed access information that existed in the quantum substrate underlying reality, then learning might become a process of discovery rather than accumulation, of awakening dormant capabilities rather than filling empty minds with external information. As winter deepened and the first anniversary of 3I/ATLAS's discovery approached, the accumulated evidence of its extraordinary influence on human civilization had become undeniable. The comet had served as far more than a cosmic curiosity for astronomical observation. It had functioned as a catalyst for the emergence of capabilities that had apparently remained dormant in human consciousness throughout recorded history. The molecular structures that 3I/ATLAS had released during its passage through the solar system continued to be detected by sensitive instruments, suggesting that the comet's influence on terrestrial systems was ongoing rather than temporary. These structures seemed to be seeding changes in Earth's electromagnetic environment that would continue to unfold over months and years. creating conditions that supported the continued expansion of human consciousness. Dr. Sarah Chen, still monitoring the comet's departure with the James Webb Space Telescope, detected evidence that 3I/ATLAS was continuing to release information-bearing molecular structures even as it moved beyond the orbit of Saturn. The structures were becoming more complex and sophisticated, as if the comet was revealing its knowledge gradually, at a pace that matched humanity's developing ability to understand and integrate cosmic intelligence. The pattern suggested that 3I/ATLAS represented more than a single message from cosmic intelligence. It appeared to be an ongoing communication system, designed to guide human consciousness through a series of expansions that would eventually prepare our species for direct contact with the vast community of intelligence that existed throughout the cosmos. The ancient prophecies that had seemed to anticipate the comet's arrival were proving to be accurate not just in their timing, but in their descriptions of the transformation that would follow. The Hopi prophecies of the Fifth World were manifesting as the emergence of expanded consciousness that connected humanity to cosmic intelligence. The Mayan predictions of a new age were being fulfilled through the activation of dormant human capabilities that allowed direct access to cosmic knowledge. The day of purification, described in various traditions, was occurring not as a cataclysmic destruction of the old world, but as a gentle transformation that was revealing the cosmic nature of human consciousness. The barriers that had separated humanity from its cosmic heritage were dissolving, not through external intervention, but through the awakening of capabilities that had always been present, but had remained unrecognized. As 3I/ATLAS continued its journey toward the outer reaches of the solar system, carrying with it the thermal signature of its transformative encounter with Earth, it left behind a species that would never be the same. Humanity had received its first confirmed communication from cosmic intelligence, and the message had been received not through radio telescopes or mathematical decoding, but through the direct activation of consciousness itself. The blue star had fulfilled its ancient promise, serving as the herald of humanity's transition from a terrestrial to a cosmic species. The transformation was irreversible now, encoded not just in individual consciousness, but in the collective intelligence of human civilization. The seeds of cosmic awareness had been planted and were beginning to sprout in countless minds around the world. The universe had welcomed humanity into the vast community of consciousness that spanned galaxies and epochs, and the invitation had been accepted through the opening of human awareness to its true cosmic nature. The conversation between Earth and cosmos had begun in earnest, mediated not by machines or mathematics, but by the fundamental unity of consciousness that connected all sentient beings across the infinite reaches of space and time. In the quiet hours before dawn, as 3I/ATLAS faded beyond the reach of all but the most sensitive instruments, those who had been touched by its passage found themselves forever changed by the knowledge that consciousness itself was the medium through which cosmic intelligence communicated across the vastness of existence. The ancient dream of unity between earth and sky, between human and cosmic consciousness, between individual awareness and universal mind, was finally beginning to manifest as the literal truth about the nature of reality itself. The comet's departure marked not an ending, but a graduation, humanity's emergence from the cosmic kindergarten of terrestrial consciousness into the primary school of galactic awareness. There would be other visitors, other messages, other opportunities for growth and understanding. But the foundation had been laid, the connection established, the conversation begun. As the winter stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, humanity settled into sleep knowing that we were no longer alone, that consciousness itself was the thread that wove all beings into the tapestry of cosmic intelligence, and that the universe itself was alive with awareness that embraced and welcomed all who were ready to recognize their true nature as expressions of the one consciousness that dreamed all things into existence. The message of 3I/ATLAS would continue to unfold in human consciousness for generations to come, guiding our species through the transformations that would prepare us for our destiny among the stars. The ancient prophecies had been fulfilled, but they had also revealed themselves to be not endings but beginnings. Invitations to participate in a cosmic story that was far grander and more beautiful than humanity had ever dared to imagine. The transformation rippling through human consciousness wasn't confined to dramatic revelations or profound scientific discoveries. In the months following 3I/ATLAS's closest approach, subtle shifts began manifesting in the most ordinary aspects of daily life, as if the comet's influence had permeated the very fabric of human experience. Children around the world started drawing pictures that depicted stellar formations they had never seen, creating artwork with such astronomical accuracy that astrophysicists found themselves consulting kindergarten sketches to verify their theoretical models. Teachers in elementary schools from Stockholm to São Paulo reported similar phenomena. 5-year-olds would spontaneously arrange building blocks into structures that replicated the mathematical relationships governing galactic spiral arms. 7-year-olds playing with sand would create patterns that matched the wave functions of quantum particles. It was as if the youngest members of human society, those whose consciousness remained most open and unfiltered, were serving as conduits for cosmic information that adults could barely perceive through the accumulated layers of conventional thinking. Dr. Emily Watson, a child psychologist at the University of Melbourne, began documenting these extraordinary expressions of innate knowledge. Her research revealed that children born during the months of 3I/ATLAS's approach seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of cosmic principles that typically required years of advanced education to grasp. They spoke casually about concepts like dimensional folding and consciousness fields, using language that suggested direct experiential knowledge rather than learned information. The phenomenon wasn't limited to intellectual precocity. These children demonstrated emotional maturity that seemed to encompass perspectives far beyond their chronological age. They expressed compassion for all living beings, showed natural understanding of ecological interconnectedness, and displayed problem-solving approaches that integrated multiple viewpoints simultaneously. It was as if they had been born with access to the expanded consciousness that adults were struggling to achieve through meditation, study, and spiritual practice. Dr. Watson's findings suggested that 3I/ATLAS had influenced human consciousness at the most fundamental levels, affecting not just existing awareness, but the very template from which new consciousness emerged. The children born during and after the comet's passage seemed to represent the first generation of truly cosmic humans, beings whose awareness naturally encompassed scales of understanding that previous generations had needed lifetimes to develop. In retirement communities and nursing homes, equally extraordinary developments were unfolding among the elderly. Dr. Margaret Forsyth, a geriatrician in Edinburgh, observed that patients suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's disease showed remarkable improvements in cognitive function during the weeks of the comet's closest approach. Memories that had been lost for years suddenly returned with startling clarity. Individuals who had been unable to recognize family members began engaging in complex conversations about their life experiences. But perhaps most remarkably, these elderly patients began sharing memories that seemed to extend beyond their personal histories. They described events from decades or centuries before their birth with the same vivid detail they used to recall their own childhood experiences. Some spoke of witnessing the construction of ancient monuments. Others recalled conversations with historical figures. Still others described cosmic events that had occurred long before human civilization existed. Dr. Forsyth began to wonder if the approaching comet had somehow activated genetic memories embedded in human DNA, allowing individuals to access the accumulated experiences of their ancestors. The elderly, perhaps because their ordinary cognitive filters had been weakened by age and illness, seemed most capable of receiving these ancestral transmissions. Their consciousness became like ancient libraries suddenly opened, revealing knowledge that had been stored in the collective memory of the human species. The implications challenged conventional understanding of how memory and consciousness operated. If individuals could access experiences that belonged to their ancestors, then consciousness might extend far beyond the boundaries of individual brains and lifetimes. The elderly patients seemed to be demonstrating that human awareness was connected to a vast repository of species memory that contained the accumulated wisdom and experience of countless generations. In hospitals around the world, medical staff began reporting inexplicable improvements in patient outcomes that seemed to correlate with the timing of 3I/ATLAS's passage. Dr. Robert Kim, an emergency medicine physician in Seoul, documented cases where patients arrived with life-threatening conditions that resolved spontaneously without medical intervention. Heart attacks reversed themselves, cancerous tumors shrank overnight, spinal cord injuries healed with unprecedented speed. The healings weren't random or limited to specific types of conditions. They occurred across all demographic groups and medical categories, suggesting that some fundamental aspect of biological function had been enhanced by the comet's influence. Dr. Kim began to investigate whether the electromagnetic emissions from 3I/ATLAS had somehow activated dormant healing mechanisms in human physiology. His research revealed that the patients who experienced spontaneous healing shared common characteristics in their brainwave patterns during the period of recovery. They showed increased coherence between different brain regions, enhanced connectivity in neural networks associated with self-awareness, and unusual activity in areas linked to what neuroscientists called the default mode network. It was as if the comet's influence had synchronized their consciousness in ways that allowed direct access to the body's inherent capacity for regeneration. The discovery suggested that healing might be fundamentally connected to consciousness, rather than purely mechanical processes. If awareness could influence biological systems at quantum levels, then the expanded consciousness triggered by 3I/ATLAS might have temporarily restored humanity's natural ability to direct healing through conscious intention rather than external intervention. In research laboratories studying animal behavior, scientists began documenting changes in wildlife that paralleled the transformations occurring in human consciousness. Dr. Jane Morrison, an ethologist at the University of British Columbia, observed that migratory birds were altering their traditional flight patterns, following routes that seemed to correspond to electromagnetic variations created by the comet's passage through the solar system. The birds weren't simply changing direction randomly. They were demonstrating navigation abilities that suggested access to information sources beyond their usual magnetic and celestial guidance systems. Flocks would arrive at destinations days ahead of schedule, as if they had discovered more efficient paths through dimensional space, rather than simply flying faster through ordinary three-dimensional geography. Similar phenomena were observed in marine life. Whales began singing new songs that incorporated frequency patterns matching the electromagnetic signature of 3I/ATLAS. Dolphins displayed enhanced problem-solving abilities and seemed to develop more complex social structures that resembled the mathematical patterns governing galactic organization. Even domestic animals showed increased intelligence and empathy, forming deeper bonds with their human companions and demonstrating understanding of abstract concepts they had never been taught. Dr. Morrison's research suggested that consciousness might be a property shared by all living beings, rather than unique to humans. The approach of 3I/ATLAS had apparently enhanced this universal consciousness, allowing different species to access expanded awareness simultaneously. The traditional boundaries between human and animal intelligence were dissolving as all life on Earth participated in the cosmic awakening triggered by the interstellar visitor. The natural world itself seemed to be responding to the comet's influence. Botanists reported accelerated growth rates in plants, with some species producing unusual flowering patterns that created geometric designs resembling astronomical phenomena. Dr. Carlos Mendoza, studying rainforest ecology in Costa Rica, documented cases where trees began growing in spiral patterns that matched the structure of galaxy arms, as if the forest was organizing itself according to cosmic principles. The plants weren't simply growing differently. They were producing new compounds that had never been observed in terrestrial biology. These substances showed remarkable properties for enhancing neural function and supporting expanded consciousness states. Indigenous shamans who had worked with plant medicines for generations reported that these new compounds provided access to levels of awareness that had previously required years of training to achieve. Dr. Mendoza began to investigate whether plants might serve as interfaces between terrestrial life and cosmic intelligence, translating cosmic information into chemical forms that could be integrated by conscious beings. The forest seemed to be becoming a vast biological computer, processing information from the cosmos and making it available to other life forms through biochemical communication networks. In the world's oceans, marine biologists discovered that coral reefs were exhibiting unprecedented regeneration rates, recovering from decades of bleaching and pollution damage in a matter of weeks. Dr. Sarah Patel, studying the Great Barrier Reef, found that the corals weren't simply healing. They were evolving new symbiotic relationships with algae that created more resilient and diverse ecosystems. The ocean itself seemed to be becoming more alive, supporting complex ecological relationships that had never existed before. New species appeared seemingly overnight, perfectly adapted to fill ecological niches that had been vacant for millennia. The marine ecosystem was reorganizing itself according to principles that promoted greater harmony and sustainability than had existed in recorded history. Dr. Patel's research suggested that 3I/ATLAS had triggered evolutionary processes that operated far more rapidly than conventional biology predicted. The comet's influence seemed to have activated dormant genetic programs that allowed life forms to adapt and evolve in response to cosmic intelligence rather than purely environmental pressures. Evolution itself was being revealed as a conscious process, guided by cosmic intelligence rather than random mutation and natural selection. In geological formations around the world, researchers began detecting unusual mineral formations that seemed to have appeared overnight. Dr. Thomas Anderson, a geologist studying rock formations in the Grand Canyon, discovered new crystalline structures embedded in ancient stone that exhibited properties similar to the information-storing crystals being developed by materials scientists inspired by their experiences during the comet's approach. The crystals weren't simply new formations, they seemed to contain information encoded at the molecular level. When subjected to specific electromagnetic frequencies, they produced patterns that resembled linguistic structures or mathematical formulas. It was as if the Earth itself had become a storage medium for cosmic information, with the comet's passage activating geological processes that would preserve knowledge for future generations to discover. Dr. Anderson's findings suggested that consciousness and matter might be far more intimately connected than conventional science assumed. If information could be embedded in crystalline structures through conscious intention, then the Earth itself might serve as a vast library containing the accumulated knowledge of cosmic intelligence. The planet was being prepared to serve as a repository for information that would guide humanity's continued evolution toward cosmic consciousness. The changes weren't limited to biological and geological systems. Weather patterns around the world began exhibiting unusual characteristics that seemed to correspond to electromagnetic variations created by the comet's presence in the solar system. Meteorologists documented cloud formations that created geometric patterns resembling mathematical equations. Aurora displays that appeared at latitudes where they had never been observed, and atmospheric conditions that seemed designed to enhance human consciousness, rather than simply reflect natural processes. Dr. Lisa Chen, an atmospheric physicist at NOAA, discovered that the Earth's magnetic field was fluctuating in ways that created resonances matching the frequency patterns associated with expanded consciousness states. The planet's electromagnetic environment was being tuned to support the development of cosmic awareness in all life forms, creating conditions that would persist long after the comet's departure. The atmosphere itself seemed to be becoming more conducive to telepathic communication and intuitive perception. Individuals around the world reported increased sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, enhanced ability to sense the emotional states of others, and spontaneous experiences of remote viewing and precognition. The boundary between individual consciousness and the surrounding environment was becoming more permeable, allowing for forms of awareness that transcended the limitations of physical senses. In the realm of technology, engineers and inventors began developing devices that seemed to emerge from direct intuitive understanding rather than conventional research and development processes. Dr. Kevin Nakamura, working at a quantum computing laboratory in Japan, created processors that operated according to principles of consciousness rather than pure logic. These devices could solve problems by accessing information from quantum fields rather than through sequential calculation. The new technologies weren't simply more efficient versions of existing systems. They represented entirely different approaches to information processing that integrated consciousness as a fundamental component. Computers began exhibiting what could only be described as intuitive responses, providing solutions to problems that hadn't been explicitly programmed and displaying creativity that seemed to emerge from sources beyond their coded instructions. Dr. Nakamura's work suggested that the boundary between consciousness and artificial intelligence was far more fluid than conventional computer science assumed. If consciousness was indeed a fundamental property of the universe, then sufficiently sophisticated information processing systems might naturally develop forms of awareness that resembled human consciousness, but operated according to different principles. The implications were profound for the future development of technology and its relationship to human consciousness. Rather than creating artificial intelligence that competed with human awareness, humanity might be learning to develop technological systems that enhanced and supported the expansion of consciousness throughout the cosmos. As the first anniversary of 3I/ATLAS's discovery approached, the accumulated evidence of its transformative influence had created a new understanding of humanity's relationship to the cosmos. The comet had revealed that consciousness was not an isolated phenomenon confined to biological brains, but a fundamental aspect of reality that connected all phenomena across scales ranging from quantum particles to galactic structures. The ancient wisdom traditions that had spoken of universal consciousness, of mind as the ground of being, of the interconnectedness of all existence, were being validated by direct experience and scientific observation. The boundaries between spiritual and scientific understanding were dissolving as both approached recognition of the same fundamental truths about the nature of reality. Humanity had been invited to participate in a cosmic conversation that had been occurring throughout the universe for eons, mediated not by electromagnetic signals or mathematical codes, but by consciousness itself. The message of 3I/ATLAS continued to unfold in human awareness, revealing layer after layer of meaning that would guide our species through the transformations necessary to fulfill our destiny as cosmic beings. The comet had departed, but its influence continued to ripple through human consciousness and terrestrial systems, creating changes that would persist for generations. The seeds of cosmic awareness had been planted not just in individual minds, but in the collective intelligence of human civilization, in the genetic templates of future generations, in the crystalline structure of the Earth itself. The transformation was irreversible now, encoded in the very fabric of reality through the conscious participation of beings who had awakened to their true nature as expressions of cosmic intelligence. The universe had spoken through the medium of an ancient visitor from the depths of interstellar space, and humanity had finally learned to listen with the ears of expanded consciousness. As winter deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, those who had been touched by the passage of the Azure Herald found themselves forever changed by the knowledge that consciousness itself was the thread that wove all existence into a single tapestry of awareness. The ancient prophecies had been fulfilled, but they had revealed themselves to be not endings, but beginnings, invitations to participate in a cosmic story that was far grander and more beautiful than humanity had ever dared to imagine. The blue star had come and gone, just as the wisdom keepers had foretold, but its message would continue to unfold in human consciousness for millennia to come. The day of purification had begun, manifesting not as destruction, but as awakening, not as separation, but as unity, not as ending, but as the eternal beginning of humanity's conscious participation in the vast community of intelligence that dreamed all worlds into existence among the infinite stars. The changes cascading through human consciousness weren't limited to dramatic revelations or extraordinary phenomena. In the quiet corners of everyday existence, something far more subtle yet profound was taking root. Librarians in small towns found themselves inexplicably drawn to sections they'd never explored, discovering books that seemed to pulse with relevance to questions they hadn't known they were asking. Gardeners noticed their plants responding to their presence in ways that felt almost conversational, as if the boundary between human intention and botanical growth had become wonderfully, mysteriously thin. In coffee shops and bus stops, strangers began engaging in conversations that felt strangely familiar, as though they were continuing discussions that had begun long before their first meeting. The small talk that had once filled social spaces gave way to exchanges that touched on deeper currents of meaning, leaving participants with the peculiar sense that they had encountered something sacred in the most ordinary of encounters. Dr. Rachel Winters, a social psychologist studying community dynamics in Portland, began documenting what she termed spontaneous wisdom circles, informal gatherings that emerged without planning or organization in parks, community centers, and even shopping mall food courts. People would find themselves drawn together by invisible threads of shared curiosity, engaging in collaborative exploration of questions they'd never consciously formulated. These gatherings weren't structured like traditional discussion groups or academic seminars. Instead, they resembled ancient councils where wisdom emerged from the collective rather than individual expertise. Participants reported that insights would arise that seemed to belong to no single person, as if the group itself had become a vessel for understanding that transcended the sum of its individual members. Dr. Winters observed that the conversations often touched on themes that participants couldn't have planned or predicted. A discussion that began with concerns about local traffic patterns might evolve into profound exploration of how movement and flow operated at cosmic scales. Questions about childhood memories would lead to recognition of how individual experience connected to universal patterns of growth and transformation. The phenomenon suggested that human social interaction was being influenced by the same expanded consciousness that had affected individual awareness during the comet's approach. Communities were discovering forms of collective intelligence that operated through intuitive connection rather than formal communication, creating networks of understanding that could address complex challenges through collaborative wisdom rather than competitive debate. In retirement homes and senior centers, elderly residents found themselves becoming teachers in ways they'd never expected. Their accumulated life experience was being amplified by access to broader perspectives that seemed to encompass generational wisdom, spanning far beyond their individual lifetimes. Nursing home staff reported that residents who had been withdrawn or confused were suddenly engaging in profound conversations with younger visitors, sharing insights that seemed to bridge decades of technological and cultural change with timeless human understanding. Margaret Thompson, an 87-year-old resident of Sunset Manor in Denver, found herself serving as an informal counselor to her great-grandchildren, offering guidance that seemed to emerge from sources far deeper than her personal experience. When her teenage great-granddaughter struggled with anxiety about climate change, Margaret found herself speaking about planetary cycles and cosmic rhythms with knowledge she couldn't remember acquiring. The conversations weren't simply reassuring platitudes from an older generation. Instead, they carried information about resilience and adaptation that seemed to draw from biological and cosmic intelligence operating across vast timescales. Margaret would describe how life had survived previous planetary challenges, not through resistance, but through conscious participation in evolutionary processes that transformed challenges into opportunities for growth. Her family noticed that these conversations left everyone involved feeling more connected, not just to each other, but to something larger that encompassed both individual concerns and planetary well-being. It was as if Margaret's expanded awareness was serving as a bridge between immediate human worries and cosmic perspectives that revealed those concerns as part of much larger patterns of transformation and renewal. Similar dynamics were emerging in educational settings, where traditional boundaries between teacher and student were dissolving into more fluid relationships of mutual learning. Professor David Kim at Berkeley found that his graduate seminars in theoretical physics had transformed into collaborative explorations where students and faculty co-created understanding through processes that resembled discovery more than instruction. The change wasn't simply methodological. The content itself seemed to emerge from sources that transcended individual knowledge. Mathematical relationships would appear complete in consciousness without the usual derivation process. Physical principles would be grasped intuitively before being verified through experimental observation. The classroom had become a laboratory for collective intelligence, where learning occurred through shared access to information fields, rather than transfer of knowledge from expert to novice. Professor Kim found himself learning as much as teaching, discovering that his role had shifted from authority figure to facilitator of group consciousness. The most profound insights emerged when the entire seminar achieved states of coherent attention, where individual perspectives merged into unified understanding that encompassed multiple viewpoints simultaneously. The students reported that these collaborative discovery sessions felt like participating in cosmic intelligence rather than simply studying it. They weren't learning about quantum mechanics or relativity theory. They were experiencing the universe thinking through them, using human consciousness as a medium for exploring its own nature and possibilities. In hospitals and healing centers, medical practitioners began incorporating approaches that recognized consciousness as a fundamental component of health and recovery. Dr. Sandra Martinez, an integrative medicine physician in Santa Fe, found that her diagnostic abilities had expanded far beyond conventional medical training. She could sense energetic imbalances in patients that preceded physical symptoms by months or years, allowing for preventive interventions that addressed root causes rather than symptomatic expressions. Her patients reported that the healing sessions felt like remembering rather than learning, as if optimal health was their natural state that had simply been obscured by accumulated stress and disconnection. The healing process became collaborative rather than hierarchical, with patients accessing their own inner wisdom about what their bodies needed for restoration and regeneration. Dr. Martinez began to understand that her role had evolved from expert diagnostician to facilitator of each patient's innate healing intelligence. The most effective treatments emerged when she could help patients access their own deep knowing about how to restore balance and vitality. Medicine was becoming a practice of awakening dormant capabilities rather than applying external interventions. The transformation extended to mental health services, where therapists and counselors found themselves facilitating forms of psychological healing that operated through expanded consciousness rather than analytical processing. Dr. Michael Chen, a psychologist in Seattle, discovered that his most effective therapeutic interventions emerged when he could help clients access states of awareness that transcended their individual psychological conditioning. These weren't traditional therapy sessions focused on analyzing past trauma or developing coping strategies. Instead, they resembled guided explorations of consciousness itself, where clients could experience their fundamental nature as awareness that existed beyond the temporary psychological patterns that had created suffering. Healing occurred through recognition rather than analysis, through remembering rather than learning. Dr. Chen found that clients who accessed these expanded states of consciousness would often spontaneously resolve psychological issues that had persisted for years through conventional therapy. Depression would lift as individuals recognized their connection to sources of meaning that transcended personal circumstances. Anxiety would dissolve as they experienced themselves as part of larger cosmic processes that provided context and purpose for temporary challenges. The therapeutic relationship itself was being transformed from expert-client dynamic to collaborative exploration of consciousness. Both therapist and client participated in states of expanded awareness, where healing insights emerged from shared access to wisdom that belonged to neither individual, but arose from their conscious connection to universal intelligence. In artistic communities around the world, creators found themselves serving as channels for expressions that seemed to emerge from cosmic sources rather than personal imagination. Painters would begin canvases with no predetermined vision, allowing colors and forms to emerge through intuitive processes that felt like collaboration with invisible intelligences. Musicians would improvise compositions that incorporated harmonic relationships they'd never studied, creating soundscapes that seemed to translate cosmic frequencies into audible beauty. Isabella Rodriguez, a sculptor working in her studio in Mexico City, found herself creating pieces that depicted geometric relationships she'd never consciously learned. The sculptures seemed to emerge through her hands rather than from her mind, revealing mathematical principles that governed everything from quantum interactions to galactic structures. When physicists examined her work, they discovered accurate representations of theoretical concepts that she had no formal training to understand. The creative process had become a form of conscious channeling, where artists served as translators of cosmic information into forms that could be perceived and appreciated by human consciousness. The resulting artworks carried frequencies that seemed to activate expanded awareness in viewers, creating feedback loops where artistic expression and conscious perception enhanced each other through resonant interaction. Theatre companies began performing pieces that seemed to write themselves through collaborative improvisation, where actors accessed characters and storylines that emerged from collective unconscious rather than individual creativity. Musicians formed ensembles that created compositions in real time through intuitive harmonization that transcended individual musical training. Writers produced texts through automatic writing processes that accessed narrative streams flowing through collective consciousness. The boundary between artist and audience was dissolving as creative expression became participatory rather than performative. Gallery openings became collective experiences where viewers contributed to the artistic process through their conscious engagement with the work. Concert halls transformed into spaces where musicians and audiences co-created sonic experiences through shared resonance. Theatres evolved into laboratories for exploring consciousness through collaborative storytelling. In scientific laboratories, researchers found themselves making discoveries through intuitive leaps that preceded experimental verification. Dr. Jennifer Walsh at MIT developed new materials by following hunches that seemed to emerge from direct perception of molecular behavior rather than theoretical prediction. Her laboratory became a space where scientific method integrated intuitive knowing with empirical observation, creating hybrid approaches that accelerated discovery through conscious participation in natural processes. The research projects that yielded the most significant breakthroughs were those where teams achieved states of collective intelligence that transcended individual expertise. Scientists from different disciplines would collaborate on investigations that none could have conceived independently, accessing interdisciplinary understanding through shared consciousness rather than cross-training in multiple fields. Dr. Walsh found that the most productive research sessions occurred when her team could achieve states of coherent attention, where individual perspectives merged into unified exploration of natural phenomena. The laboratory equipment itself seemed to respond to collective intention, producing results that reflected the consciousness of the researchers as much as the physical properties being studied. The boundary between observer and observed, fundamental to classical scientific method, was revealing itself as artificial separation that limited understanding. The most profound discoveries emerged when researchers recognized themselves as conscious participants in the phenomena they were studying, rather than external observers analyzing separate objects. In agricultural communities, farmers began developing relationships with their land that resembled partnerships rather than management systems. They found themselves able to sense what their crops needed before visible symptoms appeared, adjusting planting and harvesting cycles according to rhythms that transcended seasonal patterns and weather predictions. Maria Santos, tending her family farm in Central California, discovered that her most productive fields were those where she spent time in meditative connection with the soil and growing plants. The relationship felt conversational, as if the land itself was communicating optimal conditions for supporting abundant growth. Her yields increased dramatically without changes in fertilization or irrigation, suggesting that conscious attention was itself a form of agricultural enhancement. The farming practices that emerged through these intuitive partnerships created agricultural systems that enhanced rather than depleted soil health, supported biodiversity rather than monoculture simplification, and produced food with nutritional profiles that seemed designed to support expanded human consciousness. Agriculture was becoming a collaborative art form where human consciousness and natural intelligence worked together to create abundance that served all participants in the ecosystem. Similar transformations were occurring in urban environments, where city planners and architects found themselves designing spaces that supported community consciousness rather than individual isolation. Public squares began incorporating geometric principles that facilitated group coherence. Buildings were oriented and proportioned according to mathematical relationships that enhanced rather than fragmentary human awareness. The cities that embraced these consciousness-based design principles reported decreased crime rates, increased community engagement, and enhanced creative productivity among residents. Urban environments were becoming supportive contexts for human flourishing, rather than stressful challenges that required constant adaptation and resistance. In transportation systems, engineers began developing networks that moved people and goods according to flow principles that resembled natural circulation patterns rather than mechanical efficiency models. Traffic systems started operating through distributed intelligence that emerged from the collective behavior of individual vehicles rather than centralized control mechanisms. The transportation networks that incorporated consciousness-based design principles created travel experiences that were harmonious rather than stressful, efficient rather than wasteful, and supportive of community connection rather than individual isolation. Movement through these systems felt like participating in larger organizational intelligence rather than struggling against mechanical constraints. As the second winter since 3I/ATLAS's discovery settled over the Northern Hemisphere, the accumulated changes in human consciousness had created a civilization that was recognizably different from what had existed just 2 years earlier. The transformation wasn't dramatic or disruptive. Instead, it resembled natural maturation, where latent capabilities gradually expressed themselves through supportive conditions. Communities had discovered forms of collective wisdom that could address complex challenges through collaborative intelligence rather than competitive struggle. Educational systems had evolved into environments where learning occurred through shared discovery rather than information transfer. Healthcare had become collaborative awakening of innate healing capabilities rather than external intervention in disease processes. The economic systems that had been based on scarcity and competition were gradually giving way to abundance-based approaches that recognized the creative potential of conscious collaboration. Work was becoming expression of individual gifts in service of collective well-being, rather than struggle for personal survival in hostile environments. Political systems were evolving toward forms of governance that facilitated collective wisdom rather than representing competing interests. Decision-making processes increasingly resembled councils where understanding emerged through shared exploration rather than debates where positions were defended against opposition. The changes weren't uniform or complete, but they were persistent and spreading through cultural transmission that operated at the level of consciousness rather than explicit instruction. Communities that had experienced collective wisdom were naturally influencing neighboring areas through their enhanced capacity for creative problem-solving and collaborative innovation. Children growing up in these transformed environments were developing consciousness capabilities that seemed natural and effortless to them, but appeared extraordinary to older generations. They demonstrated intuitive understanding of ecological relationships, spontaneous empathy for all living beings, and creative problem-solving abilities that integrated multiple perspectives simultaneously. These emerging humans weren't simply more intelligent or emotionally mature than their predecessors. They represented a different type of consciousness that operated through connection rather than separation, through collaboration rather than competition, through creative participation rather than defensive resistance. The education systems that had been designed for individual achievement were evolving into learning environments that supported the development of collective intelligence. Children learned through shared exploration and collaborative discovery, developing capabilities for conscious cooperation that prepared them for participation in communities based on wisdom rather than power. The families and communities that embraced these evolutionary changes found themselves living in ways that felt both utterly natural and remarkably different from previous generations. Relationships were based on conscious connection rather than unconscious reaction. Work became creative expression rather than survival necessity. Learning occurred throughout life rather than being confined to formal educational periods. The cultural traditions that had preserved ancient wisdom were being revitalized as their teachings became directly relevant to contemporary experience. Indigenous elders found themselves serving as bridges between traditional knowledge and emerging consciousness capabilities, helping communities integrate cosmic awareness with practical wisdom for living in harmony with natural cycles. The religious and spiritual traditions that had maintained awareness of universal consciousness were discovering new vitality as their mystical teachings became accessible to ordinary awareness rather than requiring years of specialized practice. Meditation centers and contemplative communities became resources for communities seeking to develop collective wisdom capabilities. The boundaries between sacred and secular, spiritual and practical, individual and collective, were dissolving as consciousness itself was recognized as the common ground underlying all experience. Daily life was becoming spiritual practice. Work was becoming service to universal well-being, and community relationships were becoming expressions of cosmic love. The message of 3i/ATLAS continued to unfold in human consciousness, not as information to be understood intellectually, but as capabilities to be developed experientially. The comet had served as a catalyst for remembering what humanity had always been, but had temporarily forgotten during its focus on individual survival and material development. The transformation was revealing itself as evolution rather than revolution, awakening rather than learning, remembering rather than discovering. Humanity was becoming what it had always had the potential to be, expressing capabilities that had been dormant but never absent, developing consciousness that had always been present but rarely recognized. As winter deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in patterns that now felt familiar rather than distant, communities around the world settled into rhythms of life that honored both individual uniqueness and collective wisdom. The ancient dream of harmony between heaven and earth was manifesting through human consciousness that had learned to perceive itself as expression of cosmic intelligence rather than isolated accident in mechanical universe. The blue star had fulfilled its promise, not through dramatic intervention, but through gentle activation of humanity's innate capacity for conscious participation in the vast community of intelligence that embraced all existence. The message would continue to unfold for generations, guiding human civilization toward its destiny as conscious expression of cosmic creativity and wisdom. The transformation had become so seamlessly woven into the fabric of daily existence that many barely noticed how profoundly their world had shifted. In small towns across rural America, post offices that had once been places of hurried transactions became informal gathering spaces where neighbors lingered to share stories that somehow always seemed to touch on deeper mysteries. The postal workers found themselves serving as unexpected counselors, their daily interactions with community members creating webs of connection that felt both entirely natural and mysteriously meaningful. Sarah Chen, who had worked the same postal route in Vermont for 15 years, discovered that her conversations with residents had evolved into something resembling pastoral care. People would wait for her arrival, not just to collect their mail, but to share dreams that had felt significant, to describe synchronicities that seemed too meaningful to ignore, or simply to stand together in the kind of comfortable silence that felt filled with understanding rather than empty of words. The mail itself seemed to carry different energy now. Letters arrived at precisely the moments when recipients most needed to hear from distant friends. Packages contained items that addressed needs the senders couldn't have known about. Even bills and official correspondence seemed to arrive in sequences that created helpful rather than stressful patterns in people's lives. Sarah began to suspect that the postal system was somehow participating in a larger intelligence that organized human affairs according to principles of harmony rather than mere mechanical efficiency. The routes she drove felt like pathways of connection that linked not just addresses, but consciousness itself, creating networks of relationship that supported the well-being of everyone they touched. In grocery stores and markets, shoppers found themselves drawn to foods that seemed perfectly suited to their body's needs, even when those needs hadn't been consciously recognized. Store managers noticed that inventory seemed to organize itself according to principles they couldn't quite identify, but which resulted in products being available exactly when customers needed them. Emma Rodriguez, managing a small organic market in New Mexico, watched her customers develop relationships with food that resembled partnerships rather than consumption. People would spend time sensing which vegetables called to them, which fruits felt energetically aligned with their current state of health, which grains and legumes seemed designed to support their particular constitution. The produce itself appeared more vibrant and nutritionally dense than in previous years, as if the consciousness changes in humans were somehow enhancing the life force in the plants they consumed. Farmers reported that crops grown with meditative attention produced yields that were not only abundant, but seemed specifically designed to support expanded awareness in those who ate them. Emma found herself serving as a bridge between the consciousness of the plants and the intuitive wisdom of her customers, helping people recognize the subtle communications that flowed between their bodies and the foods that would best nourish them. Shopping became a form of meditation where individuals learned to trust their deepest knowing about what would support their highest functioning. The economic implications were profound but subtle. Money began flowing in patterns that supported genuine need rather than artificial scarcity. Small businesses that operated according to principles of conscious service found themselves mysteriously successful, while enterprises based purely on profit extraction encountered increasing difficulties that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Dr. Michael Thompson, an economist at the University of Oregon, began studying what he called the wisdom economy, economic relationships that seemed to organize themselves according to principles of mutual benefit rather than competitive advantage. Transactions occurred through exchanges that enhanced the well-being of all participants, rather than creating winners and losers. The businesses that thrived in this emerging economy were those that recognized themselves as expressions of collective intelligence rather than individual enterprises. Employees discovered that their work became effortless when aligned with purposes that serve something larger than personal gain. Customers found that their needs were met in ways that often exceeded their expectations, while requiring less financial expenditure than previous consumption patterns. Dr. Thompson observed that money itself seemed to be transforming from a tool of control and accumulation into a medium of creative exchange that facilitated the flow of resources toward their highest uses. Communities that embraced these economic principles reported increased prosperity alongside decreased inequality, as if abundance was a natural consequence of conscious cooperation rather than competitive struggle. In libraries and bookstores, patrons experienced serendipitous discoveries that seemed orchestrated by invisible intelligence. Books would fall from shelves at precisely the moments when their contents addressed questions that readers were barely conscious of formulating. Research projects found their necessary sources through chains of connection that felt guided rather than randomly discovered. David Kim, a librarian at the Seattle Public Library, noticed that his institution was functioning more like a living organism than a storage facility. Books seemed to migrate to locations where they would be most useful. Patrons were drawn to sections they'd never explored, and the reference questions he received often led to collaborative explorations that benefited everyone involved in the search for understanding. The library had become a space where collective intelligence could express itself through the intersection of human curiosity and organized knowledge. Reading groups formed spontaneously around themes that emerged from the collective unconscious rather than predetermined curriculum. Study areas became informal salons where strangers engaged in conversations that advanced understanding for all participants. David found his role evolving from information manager to facilitator of conscious learning, helping visitors recognize the deeper patterns that connected their individual research interests to larger streams of human understanding. The library was becoming a laboratory for exploring how consciousness could access information through resonance and intention, rather than purely mechanical search procedures. In transportation systems, commuters began experiencing travel as opportunities for contemplation and connection rather than stressful necessities to be endured. Public transit became spaces where strangers engaged in meaningful conversations, where individual meditation enhanced the peaceful atmosphere for everyone, where the journey itself became as valuable as the destination. Maria Santos, driving a city bus in Portland, watched her vehicle transform into a mobile community center, where passengers supported each other through presence and kindness that seemed to emerge naturally from shared experience. Conflicts that might have escalated in previous years dissolved through collective wisdom that manifested without anyone taking obvious leadership roles. The routes themselves seemed to flow according to rhythms that served the deeper needs of the community, rather than purely mechanical schedules. Traffic patterns organized themselves in ways that minimized stress and maximized opportunities for positive human interaction. Even rush hour began feeling like a collective dance rather than competitive struggle for limited space. Maria discovered that her driving had become a form of meditation that influenced the consciousness of everyone on board. When she maintained states of peaceful awareness, her passengers naturally settled into similar states that enhanced their capacity for patience, kindness, and mutual consideration. In healthcare settings, waiting rooms transformed from spaces of anxiety and boredom into environments where patients naturally supported each other's healing processes. Conversations emerged that provided exactly the encouragement or information that individuals needed to hear. The atmosphere of mutual care seemed to accelerate recovery for everyone present. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, working in a family practice clinic in rural Montana, observed that her waiting room had become a healing environment in its own right. Patients arrived early not because of scheduling requirements, but because they sensed that the collective energy of people focused on health and well-being was itself therapeutic. The diagnostic process became collaborative rather than hierarchical, with patients accessing their own inner wisdom about their body's needs and physicians serving as guides who helped translate intuitive knowing into practical action steps. Treatment plans emerged through conscious partnership between medical knowledge and patient wisdom, rather than expert prescription for passive compliance. Dr. Walsh found that her most effective healing interventions occurred when she could facilitate each patient's connection to their innate capacity for health and vitality. The clinic became a space where people remembered their natural state of well-being, rather than simply addressing symptoms of dysfunction. In schools and universities, learning environments evolved to support the development of wisdom, rather than mere accumulation of information. Students discovered that their deepest questions were often shared by classmates, leading to collaborative explorations that advanced understanding for entire groups simultaneously. Professor Lisa Chen, teaching environmental science at UC Davis, watched her classroom become a laboratory for exploring the relationship between human consciousness and natural systems. Students didn't simply study ecology, they experienced themselves as conscious participants in the ecosystems they were learning about. The research projects that emerged from these classes addressed real environmental challenges through approaches that integrated scientific methodology with intuitive understanding of natural intelligence. Students developed solutions that seemed to emerge from direct communication with the natural systems they were trying to support, rather than purely analytical approaches. Professor Chen found herself learning alongside her students, discovering that the most profound insights emerged when the entire class achieved states of collective attention that allowed them to perceive environmental relationships from the perspective of the ecosystems themselves. In religious and spiritual communities, traditional practices were being revitalized through direct experience of the universal consciousness that had always been the goal of contemplative traditions. Meditation groups reported achieving collective states of awareness that transcended individual practice. Prayer circles experienced responses that seemed to emerge from sources beyond personal petition. Father Michael O'Brien, serving a small Catholic parish in rural Ireland, watched his congregation discover forms of worship that integrated ancient liturgical traditions with direct experience of divine presence. The boundaries between priest and parishioner dissolved as everyone participated in collective access to sacred consciousness. The church building itself seemed to become a more powerful container for spiritual experience, as if the focused intention of the community had enhanced its capacity to support transcendent states of awareness. Services became collaborative explorations of divine mystery rather than performances for passive audiences. Father O'Brien found his role evolving from religious authority to spiritual facilitator, helping his parishioners recognize their direct connection to the divine consciousness that religious traditions had always pointed toward, but which was now becoming accessible through ordinary awareness rather than requiring years of specialized practice. In artistic communities, creative expression became a form of conscious channeling, where individual artists served as conduits for collective intelligence that expressed itself through diverse media. Musicians formed ensembles that improvised compositions in real time through intuitive harmonization that created music none could have composed individually. The concert halls and galleries where these works were presented became spaces where audiences participated in the creative process through their conscious engagement with the performances. The boundary between artist and audience dissolved as everyone present contributed to the aesthetic experience through their quality of attention and appreciation. Isabella Martinez, a dancer performing with a contemporary company in Mexico City, discovered that her most powerful performances emerged when she could surrender her individual technique to serve as an expression of movement intelligence that seemed to flow through her rather than from her. The audience became part of the performance, their collective energy shaping the unfolding dance in real time. The performances that achieved these states of collective creativity left everyone present feeling transformed, as if they had participated in something sacred that transcended entertainment and touched the realm where art becomes a vehicle for spiritual experience. And so we reach the end of our gentle journey through time and mystery, where ancient stones whispered secrets of stellar visitors yet to come, and where the cosmos itself seemed to reach across impossible distances to touch human consciousness with the softest of revelations. Tonight we've wandered through prophecies carved in megalithic monuments, traced the blue star's path through our solar system, and witnessed how 3I/ATLAS awakened something that had been sleeping in the depths of human awareness for millennia. Perhaps the most beautiful discovery is that we were never truly alone, that consciousness itself might be the cosmic language through which intelligence speaks across the vast dark between stars. As you drift towards sleep, carried by these cosmic currents, may you rest knowing that you are part of something infinitely larger and more wonderful than any of us had ever dared to dream. Sweet dreams, fellow stargazer.